Welcome back to the Dynamic Leadership Innovation Series. This is part two in our ongoing conversation about leading change. If you joined us last time, you'll remember we looked at the tension between staying grounded in reality for near-term execution while also embracing the landscape of infinite possibilities that visionary leadership requires. I framed it with one of my favorite reminders. Most people overestimate what they can do in a year and underestimate what they can do in a decade. That's why I say in the right conditions, 10X is within reach if you play the long game and lead with intention. Now, today we're going to take that idea of long-range scaling and break it down into something actionable. Assuming your business is growing, innovation isn't optional, it's necessary. Scaling means new pressures, new demands, and new opportunities, and it raises a key question. What kind of innovation is actually needed right now? One way to keep that question grounded in outcomes is to track revenue per employee. It's not the only metric, but it's a strong North Star. Because if that number is growing, you're likely scaling in the right way. With your business model, operating model, and core processes working with your growth, not against it. So today's focus is on understanding three distinct layers of innovation. Business model innovation, that's changing what you offer, who you serve, or how you generate revenue. Operating model innovation, changing how the business is organized and resourced to deliver. And then process innovation, the continuous improvement of the actual work, how tasks get done day to day. I like to call it widgets in and widgets out. Not all innovation means launching something new. Often the most powerful innovations sharpen what already exists, tightening the engine so it runs better, more profitably, and with less friction. In this series, I group innovation into three categories. Innovation in response to a threat, that could be internal or external, when change is required to survive or adapt. Innovation for profitable growth, when you're creating value, building scale, and raising your revenue per employee. Now, this is like an asterisk for revenue per employee. We want profitable revenue growth. And then innovation to strengthen the core things like vertical integration, systems upgrades, or efficiency gains that give you more control, resilience, and security. Now, I put profitable growth before strengthening the core for a reason, because if the push to build resilient businesses, in the push to build resilient businesses, we can sometimes lose sight of the hard reality. Growth still has to be profitable, especially when you're scaling. Scaling isn't about doing more of what already works. It's about doing it better. Smarter structures, clearer models, more intentional leadership. That's where the metric revenue per employee becomes useful again. Why? Because it forces us to focus on structure, productivity, and accountability. The turnover is a reality. And with the 15 to 20% annual turnover that many businesses experience, you have a built-in opportunity. Every departure can serve as a strategic checkpoint. You can ask yourself, do we really need to replace this person as is? Could we combine roles? Should we promote or add a manager instead of rehiring a specific team member? Is this the moment to pivot? Scaling creates pressure, but inside that pressure are these natural decision points. And when you lead intentionally, they become leverage points. It's also worth remembering that growth happens in stages. What works for a team of 10 doesn't hold at 25. And things that served you well at 25 employees might start to break down at 50 or 75. And while I talk about employees in the context of scaling, we could be talking about virtual teams as well, virtual members, organizations, other people who are providing the work for you. Each time you cross invisible thresholds, the seams start to show. And that's not a sign of failure. It's a reminder that you're also scaling, but you've got to adapt. Now, to bring this into focus, let's go to one of my favorite stories from Great by Choice by Jim Collins, the story of the 1911 race to the South Pole. Two teams, same destination, different equipment, different strategies, different results. Amundsen, the Norwegian explorer, followed what Collins calls the 20-mile march. You'll often hear me refer to this, and it wasn't just this expedition. 20-mile march shows up in other areas as well. Now, his deal, 15 to 20 miles a day, no matter what. In good weather, he held back. In bad weather, he kept moving. He wasn't chasing speed. He was building rhythm, recovery, and momentum. Scott, on the other hand, the British explorer, had a surge and stall approach. Push hard when it felt good, rest or struggle when it didn't. He made assumptions, skipped testing. The result? Amundsen's team made it there and back, no casualties. Scott's team not only arrived much later, it perished on the return. Now, here's the key insight. In business, you don't have a defender. No one's out there actively trying to block your plays like in sports. Most of the time, your opponent isn't the competition. It's inconsistency, lack of clarity, unforced errors. Amundsen didn't win because he was faster. He won because he was more disciplined. And that's the invitation to us as leaders. Innovation isn't just about what you design. It's how you show up, how you march, how you lead when it's boring, inconvenient, or hard. Today, we'll introduce two simple tools to help you plan your next innovation. One is a set of high-quality questions to define the gap that you're working on closing. The other is a way to compare possible solutions objectively. So you don't just chase ideas, you make informed strategic moves. Now, one of the backdrops of this, or I should say the intentions, is to build repeatability in your organizations. So your leadership team is using the same processes, the same frameworks, the same tools, and that forms a common language, and you're not second guessing, and it's not like that telephone game where the message is convoluted after 6 or 7 iterations. When you pair innovation with discipline and strategy with consistency, you don't just grow, you build something that lasts. Now, first, a quick look at the 3 layers. I want to look at the business model and operating model again, so we have a common language. So you have the business model, now how the business creates, delivers, and captures value. This is something that's going to be consistent for easily 5 to 10 years or longer. Now, sometimes you will have to change the business model, and the owner's role is to set the vision, assess viability, and then approve pivots. And there's many examples, and you can look at, was it the operating model that needed to change, or was it the business model that needed to change, or was it just process? And that's why I'm pointing this out. It's real interesting when you read the book Think and Grow Rich. He talks about 3 feet from goal, and this was the explorer who he bought this equipment and he was digging and he went broke. He sold the equipment. The person who bought it called in some geologists and they did some surveying. They found out that just shifting 3 feet, the gold vein picked up again. So the reason he bought it was because he found a vein of gold, but it quickly disappeared and he gave up. And this next person found the vein and dug and found the gold. It's a story that can get people thinking, I can never give up. I would say it's important to put a distinction around that. It's kind of nuanced in my opinion, because we also have to know when to pull back. You may not give up on the vision. This is why purpose and vision are so important, because the purpose and the vision guide you when you need to change the business model. And that's different than deciding I'm never going to change my business model. Just think about it, how it applies to your situation. But I think that it's important to understand that a business model could endure the whole time towards the vision, or it could be something that has to change. The second one is the operating model, how the business is structured to deliver on the business model. What's the structure? What's the setup? What's the flow? How do customers, or how are they acquired? How are they served? How do we handle delivery? How do we upsell? How do we cross-sell? These things would fall into the operating model. It's designing the structure, and what's often missed is accountability. So there are often times when a company thinks they have to change the operating model, but when you look deep, you realize they have no accountability. They're deviating from the model 30 and 40% of the time. Well, if they're deviating from the model 30 to 40% of the time, how do you know that the model is broken, the operating model is broken? So we want to make sure that you have accountability structures in place and that they continue to evolve as you find things. And I like this rule that if something happens one time, you notice it. You don't take action. We're not going to be chasing things all the time. And when I say don't take action, you don't change the process. You have to speak to the person if that's appropriate. If it happens a second time, you take note and you start thinking about options. You start looking at it more deeply. What are some of the inputs to that problem? What's the downstream issues with it? That's sort of the magnitude of it. And then if it happens a third time, that's when we take action and you go into process change. It has served me well, and it keeps you from chasing things too quickly, but it also keeps you from doing the same thing over and over and over, expecting a different result. So when I talk about accountability structures, sometimes we have to adjust those accountability structures because the ones we have are not working. If it's happened 3 times, telling the person again and again and again, it's a non-starter. A lot of times when these things happen over and over again, it's a habit. It's a habit that's formed either at the individual level or perhaps at the organization level, maybe the team level. Remember, habits at the team and organization level that's culture. That's your culture. We talk about culture eats strategy for lunch. And then we have the process, the day-to-day systems and workflows that make it all run. Support tools, we've got to train teams, improve routines. And this is more of a constant tweaking and process. Operating, you're always tweaking and adjusting. There's no sacred cows. I like the statement that every decision is on trial for its life. That's okay here. But in the operating or in the business model and the operating model, these things should have been thought out and designed knowing that it's going to work. So I want to just use the illustration that I did from Great by Choice and use the expedition that was talked about, the 1911 expedition to the South Pole. So Amundsen's business model, this is the one who won. He used dog sleds. He did a lot of testing, by the way, and experimenting. And it goes into some detail. This guy was definitely leading with intention. He had the end in mind, and he made strategic decisions along the way. Like he didn't even, I'm not saying this is how you should run your business, but he didn't even tell the team that they were going to the South Pole. They thought they were going to the North Pole until they were on the boat. And I think it said, and leaving. That's when he told them. And the reason, he had his reasons for doing it, but one of them was he wanted to reduce the amount of confusion and keep people focused. Anyway, and the principles stayed the same. He was to use dog sleds and native Arctic knowledge, travel consistency, 15 to 20 miles per day, regardless of weather. And that's the 20-mile march. I talk about this a lot, and it's not the same as the flywheel. But when you look at the two of those together, every day you come in and give that flywheel a turn. Well, how much do you turn it? You go back to the 20-mile march. We don't turn it and work ourselves harder and trying to turn it faster when days are good. And you want a 15 to 20-mile target. And that target should be something you could do on a bad day of a bad week, because we're going to have those. How many good weeks and good days do we have in a row? So you're going to have some bad days. You're going to have some bad weeks, and sometimes they're going to be combined. So we want to have a target that we can hit on a bad day of a bad week. And if you miss it, so be it. But at least you're not building a plan falling into the planning fallacy where you're thinking that every week I should be able to do 30 miles, because that's what I did on our personal best. And then carry only what was necessary and pre-place supplies along the route. That was huge because it meant that he had to carry less. This idea of pre-placing supplies was, I think, one of the major changes. So that's the business model. You see how the business model compared to Scott's. He mixed up his transport. He had motor sledges, ponies, man-hauling. Turned out that some of the motorized sledges wouldn't work, something with the weather, and so then they had to carry more, which just caused a cascade effect. It was an unproven hybrid model that he was using, and he didn't test it. He had an inconsistent pace. They would surge when weather was good, stall when it was bad, and then poor contingency planning. They carried heavier loads as a result. The lesson: Edmondson's model was focused, proven, and low risk. Scott's was complex, untested, and reactive. Sometimes in innovation, I talk about a short-term fix. The reason I like to introduce that short-term fix in the conversation is because it's easy to try to build the whole thing right away, and we don't do enough testing because we're in pain, right? Yeah, the reason you're making the change in this example, in the example I'm using, is because there's some kind of pain, there's some kind of loss or some kind of risk, and you want to fix it fast. That's what we do as leaders, right? But if it and in that case, I would say it needs a short-term fix. Like for example, the whole stop the bleeding, clear the airway, and then you fix the fractures. You don't go fixing the fractures first just because it's the one that's most obvious, right? Or the one that's grossing you out. So you want to test your methodologies. So here's an example. This was in the book In Search of Excellence, and he talked about this company that was making jet engines, and at that time there was a required test or certification that the engines had to meet, and that was called the 20 chicken test. And they would get the engine up to operating speed and shoot 20 chickens into it. I'm assuming they were chickens from the grocery store, right? 20 chickens into this engine. And the engine had to be able to process what was coming at it and continue operating without failing. So this particular company had a 3-year cycle on developing this jet engine. They did the 20 chicken test at the end because it wasn't ready to do the 20 chicken test until near the end, and it failed the 20 chicken test, but it failed in such a way that the correction had to be made way back in the infrastructure level. It set them back 2 years because they had to go back. So that's always been in my mind. You want to identify that equivalent of the 20 chicken test early. Test your assumptions when you build out your business model, or when you make business model changes, because you don't want to be second guessing them. You want to know that you're operating with the best practices, things that work on a bad day or a bad week, and you know they're solid, so you can focus on what's really important and not be second guessing. This is it comes up in racing a lot. You don't want to be changing multiple things at the same time. You want to, in a car or a motorcycle, you change one thing at a time and test it. One thing at a time and test it. You don't want to go out there wondering what's going to break or if something will break. So that's the focused, proven, and low risk. The low risk came because of testing, and then Scott's was untested. The operating model using the teams, using this expedition, How was the team prepared? Edmondson, he trained rigorously before the trip, built systems for food storage, navigation, and pacing. So he worked on his things. This was the testing. So the short-term fix in this case doesn't really apply, but if you're operating in a business, you may need a short-term fix to stop the bleeding or deal with the risk while you do the real testing. And it might be a year. You might spend a year in testing before you can go back to actual build. He built and then operated with clear roles, routines, and fallback plans. This would be another area that I think gets lost, and that's the organizing the work. So once you do the innovation, remember, this is a change, and we're going to talk about change management next week. But in that space, you have to talk about role responsibility, organizing the work, who's responsible, who's accountable, and be intentional about it. Don't just do what's easy. Don't do what worked the last time, because this is new, and it's easy to fall into the trap that similar means the same, and it doesn't. When you're innovating, there's all sorts of nuances that will change things. And if you're one of these, if you have team members who kind of go back to the last deck and look what was done the last time, and then they recreate that. They miss it because they don't get the nuance. And those problems, they show up in the last 20% of the time, because that's the hard work, and the hard work needs to be done early. We talked about the 80-20 rule and how 20% of the work is going to take 80% of the time. So in addition to understanding the equivalent of the 20 chicken test, we also want to understand what's the gnarly part. What's the part that's going to take us to 80% of the time? And let's get working on that first. And a lot of times I like to say, take the 20%, the gnarly part, and put that into a phase 2 automatically. And so now we're doing the easier work, because the hard part is getting it in place anyway. So we're doing the easier work during the hard part, which is getting going. And then in phase 2, we can do the 20% that takes the 80% of the time. A lot of times your project teams will resist this because they feel like phase 2s never get done. That's the project leader's responsibility. When you put in a phase 2, you also name it, you fund it, you give it the code or whatever, the placeholder, so that money is definitely being allocated for it, and that can give your team confidence. And once you've done it the one time, then they know they can trust it, because the alternative is to have scope creep. And scope creeps are, you might as well agree that you're going to have cost overruns, and you're going to miss the timeline once you start with scope creep. And then we have Scott: less preparation and more reliance on assumptions, unclear delegation and over-reliance on unproven technology, failed to adapt fast enough when equipment failed or weather worsened. I like also to talk about trial and error. I mentioned that when you're building, you want to use some trial and error. It's the iterative approach. So you're testing things as you go. And if done right, you can now also use that as a form of change management. And then Admondson's operating model was lean, well-rehearsed, and adaptive. Scott's was brittle and fragmented. Then we have the process. This is the day-to-day habit. So Admondson, he marched 15 to 20 miles daily, no more, no less, even when the weather was great, or even if they had a shorter day the day before. They didn't try to make it up. 15 to 20 miles every day. You take your loss, you take your L, and you move on. Prioritized rest, nutrition, and rhythm, and then created predictable patterns, reducing decision fatigue and risk. Scott, he pushed hard on good days, collapsed on the bad ones, suffered from erratic energy, morale, and resource use, ultimately missed return supply points, and ran out of reserves. As an aside, and I kind of talked about this last week, and I said I can go down the rabbit hole as to why this works. So there's some other work I'm doing that has to do with anti-aging, and it shows how the central nervous system has sort of a predictive component, and it can assess when more difficult demands are coming, and it floods the system with the resources necessary. This is like when you're lifting weights and you get to a space and then you hit a plateau. During the uprise, the central nervous system is flooding the body with the necessary neurotransmitters to get there, but then it falls into the routine, and that's where the plateau happens. Well, that's why bodybuilders keep changing their routine, because they have to keep flooding their body with this set of neurotransmitters to keep the signal strong. You may have to squint a little bit to see the connection here, but by doing the same thing every single day, the body made that automatic, and they had more resources. This is like hitting the plateau. It makes it automatic, and they had more resources available to deal with other surprises that come up. So the business insight, the difference wasn't the goal. It was the discipline and execution, and the match between model, operations, and daily process. Now, before I go into the planned illustration, I just want to talk about this idea of I talked about scope creep. And if you think of it as a triangle, and you have time, budget, and scope. And people struggle with this sometimes, so I put quality in the middle. because quality for some people is assumed, but because of the way cognitive biases work, it's you can see how quality can become a moving target, right? Nobody is being if no one's being measured on quality, and there's no good way to measure quality, it's very easy to fall into the trap of moving the goalposts. The reason I draw this triangle is because if you change the scope, you have to change the budget or the time. But sometimes changing the budget doesn't work. Sometimes it takes the time that it takes. And so a change in scope automatically increases the time. And you have to be disciplined as the leader. This is why I separate project leadership from project management, because the project manager is too close to it, and he or she is probably in some way incentivized to meet these three things, and they're unwilling to change. But the project leader has the responsibility for the long term, especially if you're working on a business model. You want this thing to be solid for years. It's not just a day. And as the leader, you have to decide when it's time to shift the budget or the time. And this is a good time to consider, if you haven't already, a phase two. If you're getting too much scope creep, and there's compelling reasons that you need to look at that, think about doing a phase two. Just something to consider. And this will solve that problem of the 20% taking 80% of the time, which is often why we get into the scope creep. Because the classic example is someone was thinking that they could use this thing off the shelf and insert it there and it's going to work. And it turns out it doesn't work because you got patches and security and there's not talking to each other, using a technology example. Now, I talk about clearly defining the problem is the first step in problem solving. You want to clearly define the problem and then come up with possible solutions and then determine the best solution. These are conversations that have to happen at the leadership team level. And I do like the idea of brainstorming, and keep in mind that the people who are doing the work or who are going to be using the work, I would say they should not be 100% the decision maker. You want to have a mix of people. You want to have a cross-functional team, because there's going to be people who own the work, and there are going to be people who do the work, and there will be people who have to live with the work. So you want the different groups, the delivery and the servicing entities. You want them involved in this brainstorming as you clearly define the problem, because there's always tentacles that you don't see. And if you have a myopic view, you're just creating more problems. So what we're going to do is have, as you clearly define the problem, and that's beyond the scope here. I mean, there's no, basically you're brainstorming. You have to get the right people in the room. You have to ask the right questions. You have to make sure that there's the safe environment, and then the facilitator has to reinforce that. So when somebody tries to step on someone's idea, they have to catch it very early in the session, so people get the message that this is not about judging. It's about throwing anything out there and making sure that the people who throw out the really crazy ideas are also honored and respected. And you write them down. I don't care how crazy the idea is, you want to write it down, and then people get the message. Because in a facilitated session, especially if you don't know the people, there's going to be some testing and going on. People have these preconceived thoughts about what was going on. So you need to be able to be aware of that beyond the scope of here. And it changes based on how big it is. If it's a real big long-term project, you're going to do multiple brainstorming sessions and do a drill down. If it's something we're going to change in a week and it's going to last for a month, that's a simple session. Maybe 2 people can handle it. All right. Now what we'll do is, let's say we have, out of that brainstorming, we have 3 different solutions. Then what we'll do, we're going to have leverage ease. And there's something to be said for that. Depends on the size of the thing you're working on. And again, here's where short-term fixes come into play. But sometimes you can look at degree of difficulty and ease of accomplishment and have a mix of those so you get momentum and some excitement going on early in the process. We have return and we have risk. And then we're going to score them 1 to 5, but the risk is inverted. So high risk would be high risk equals 0, low equals 5. But the other ones are straight across. So what we'll have is on leverage, let's say the leverage, we have a 4 for this one. Ease, it's going to be kind of difficult to do, so we're going to give that one a 2. And the return is kind of middle of the road, it's a 3, and the risk is a 3. Then in number 2, the leverage, there's not much leverage going on. We're going to have to create some new systems. We're going to have to add this, add that. We don't have anybody who knows the work already. By the way, leverage could be people, could be resources, could be brand. It's art, more art than science. And then ease, we have a lot of leverage. We have a fair amount of leverage, but the ease is, we already have the system set up. We have the people in place. The return is smaller. The return's only a 2. And the risk is fairly low. So we're going to give that a 4. And then just for sake of argument, we'll do this one. 3s all the way across. So we have a 12 here. We have a 14 here. And we have a 12 here. Now this, as I said, is more art than science. But this gets you to a place where you can now hand this off to a team that has a little bit more experience, maybe responsibility, the leadership team, and now they have some context with which to talk about these things because there's trade-offs. This leverage could save you a lot of time on development, and it could be more closely related to your brand. The ease, if it's a 2, if we're seeing it being a 2, I can say it's probably going to be a little bit more complex even than we're thinking. It could turn out to is really a 1. So I would be careful about a low ease score. Return, don't just look at the revenue, look at the profit. Profitable growth is much more important than just revenue growth. And then risk, of course, you might have something with a low risk or with a high risk, but we can mitigate it. There's ways that you can mitigate that risk, and you have contingency planning. So the risk, even if it does show up, it's not that significant. And by the way, risk, you can look at as severity and probability. I do this because we want to guard against the cognitive biases. I did a study of these cognitive biases thinking I could teach people about them. They're so prevalent that rather than trying to teach people cognitive biases and how to avoid them, it's easier and more effective to come up with frameworks and solutions that prevent the cognitive biases from coming into play. So by looking at risk, if you just talk about risk as risk, some people could be reacting and it could be emotional because maybe something happened to them and they're getting triggered. But the probability is so low, it's not likely going to happen. Or in another case, it might, they're worried about it because this happened 3 times last year. Oh my gosh, but the severity is so low, you can put a back-end quality checker on it and it solves the problem. Just some examples, something to think about. And then once you decide the one that you're going to use, we're then going to ask ourselves a series of questions. What are you doing? What is it that we're actually doing? And who is it for? Now, it depends on what you're talking about, but if you're changing the business model and this for whom question, it might be the owner. You want to be thinking about the sponsor. First, think about sponsor. Who's the sponsor? Who's paying for it? This is not about who's going to use it or not, or who's the owner of it after it's done. It's about the sponsor. Who's paying for it? Because that's going to keep you focused on making the tough decisions and not falling into decisions of convenience. And then why? And I like to go at least 5 levels deep on this. Why are we doing that? Why is that important? What else does that impact? Why is that? Why do we have to do it this way? What other things are involved? And it's not exactly why, but you want to drill down to understand the whys, because then that's going to inform us later on. So then we have in scope, and you'll make a list of the things that are in scope. And this should be as I said, a facilitated conversation with the stakeholders. People who are representing the sponsor would be in there, and as well as people who are going to be involved in the work. So what's in scope? And you're probably going to come up with a list of dozen items. And this is to help us avoid the scope creep. Then we're going to do out of scope. And typically when I've done this, you only come up with two or three things. What we're doing with the out of scope is what are some of the things that people would expect to have in there that's not in there. So for example, on any given day, we can come up with the list of 1,000 things that we're not doing. We can come up with the list of 1,000 things that are not in scope. We're not moving the building, we're not buying new trucks, whatever it is. But what we want to do is look. So if they're saying, hey, we want to change we're going to change our CRM system, right? We want to maybe put a line in the sand, draw a line in the sand and say, we're changing the CRM solution, but we're not going to change the enterprise structure. So in other words, we're not going to do away with the entire enterprise technology solution just to change the CRM. This just an example. So that would be listed in the out of scope because you want to take that off the table, and that's framing it. That's going to be real important for your ends. The Myers-Briggs type indicator, the people who are end, like ENTJ, or the S's, ESTJ. So the S's are going to kind of zero in on the detail and what's concrete. The N's tend to keep opening up the frame, what's possible. What else can we do? And so these out of scope lines will take those items off the table. Then we're going to have guiding principles. And you'll come up with a list of 12 of those, half dozen to 12 guiding principles. This is real helpful because it gives people freedom of action. And you want that. You want ownership to be taken. Last week, I talked about leaders have to know when to hold back and when to give more free rein. You want to be giving more freedom of action, not less. So you give that freedom of action, And the guiding principles help guide it, because then people just look to the guiding principles. I've done this so many times where the original document never changed. If you don't have the conversation up front, you get all these changes, and it's like what's happening is, by having the conversation up front, people lock in and they cut out options. If you don't have the conversation up front, you get too much of this, what about this, and chasing shiny objects. And then after the guiding principles, we have deliverables. And then you'll have your 5 or 6 deliverables, 4, 5, or 6 deliverables. And you can go to the next level and put owners next to them. I try to do this all on one page, and it's hard, but if you're facilitating a conversation, you can keep drilling down until you get it to where you can fit it onto one page. It's a one pager, and everybody would have that. You could also have the project managers who are on the sub-projects, right? If the project is made up of multiple smaller projects, each one of them can have their version of this. There's other things you can do. I do like to come up with a position statement. So the position statement, it's not the elevator pitch, but it's a brief statement that everyone can agree, this is what we're doing. This statement is easier to come up with after you've done the scope and the outer scope and the guiding principles and the deliverables. Then you come up with the revised position statement, which may be the same as this, but it might change that. So when you answered the question, what, you had a statement, some kind of a position statement for that, I would revisit it and make sure that you have one that you can serve. And then this would show up in multiple places, and you keep referring back to it as you make decisions. So that's the idea, and this can be applied whether it's a business. You can use this approach whether it's a business model change, an operating model change, or a process change. You can use this approach. And I always will remind, the first step of problem solving is clearly define the problem. And remember that if we're working on an innovation, we are solving some problem. It may not be a problem as that it's bad, but we are working to close a gap. And when you're closing that gap, the same thing applies. Clearly define the problem or the gap, and then come up with possible solutions. You've got to make sure you have that pause. I know some leaders will require their direct reports to change it over and over. They come and they ask them more questions and they ask them more questions. And I don't know if they do this intentionally because they know what they're doing, or just because it's worked. But the teams sort of uncover more things as they go back. They keep going. You know, you've heard the thing that I think it was the professor asking the student, "Did you do your best work?" And is this the best that you can do? Or is this your best work? And the student said, "No, I can do more." And then did it again. And then the third time they came back, "Is this your best work?" And the student said, "Yes, it is." And he said, "Okay, now I'll read it." It's that sort of a thinking, and these are, short-term fixes, and because people figure it out. The point is, you want to get to the essence of what that objective is, or that the intention of that little story is, which is to make sure that we're clearly defining the problem before we get started. Now, next week, we're going to talk about change management. I like to say that, number one, no plan survives contact with reality. But on the other hand, a plan that is a great plan executed poorly is going to underperform. You can take a mediocre plan and perform it with excellence, and you're going to outperform. One is because no plan survives contact with reality, so it's going to be changed. But the second thing is it's the execution, the day-to-day, the flywheel part, the 20-mile march part. That's what's going to separate it. So And that starts with change management, not just change at the front line. A lot of times we're thinking, oh, the people who are talking to the customers, we need to train them. What about the people who are managing them? What about the leaders who are over those teams? What about the C-suite? Everyone needs to go through some change management. They need to let go of some things and then add some. If you're scaling your business as you go from 25 to 100, there's some things you have to let go of. There's no sacred cows. You've got to let go of some things. And you want to let go of them with an eye to what it's going to be when you go to 200. All right, we'll talk to you next week. Change management.